Okay, I guess I have to make this recording just to get it out of the way, so I can get back to my other uh, pondering on my psychology theory and finishing that off. But anyway, so on the back of a discussion that I had on Good Mother's live stream, talking to Father Fish and having a particular, I mean, because I must say he didn't bring this issue up for me. I mean, I have been thinking about judges and kings essentially, and and the book of Samuel quite recently, because I mean this is a huge doctrinal theme in Christianity, at least, sort of the law and the fulfillment of the law and what that actually entails and what that means, and and that has a huge parallel to some of my personal private endorsement of my secular justice system and the necessity to have a rule of law. But I make that as a separate line of argument. It's not the primary line of argument that I make, because I try to make secular grounds for having it just as well. But I mean, to broadly say, somewhat spiritually, somewhat psychologically, that human beings have a huge problem with reason and responsibility. They have a huge problem with accountability. And one of the pressure release valves of this fallen state that the human condition is uh, languishing in terms of the average, or the kind of quite a common ordinary state for us to be in, is that something has to give way. We have to make a scapegoat or something like that. And you can also cue in a lot of interesting concepts from uh, sorry, I'm going to get his name wrong. This is embarrassing. Pere Girard or Girard Pere, but the mimetic desire, kind of stuff around mimetic desire. But because we're not even confident to have our own desires, and we miss these things, and we have cognitive dissonance and things like that. And how do we reconcile, or how do we resolve this iniquity within us and things like that? Now, I don't think that a secular legal system is an answer to these things, but it is a mirror that reflects the state of the condition of the spirit of man. Um, it is perhaps something that we can vest with reason and responsibility, and a kind of self-consistency and coherence that we can use as at least some kind of analogous benchmark to the spiritual need of the individual. And so the rule of law, in my view, is a necessity, because at least then you will have a structure with some self consistency and coherence, with enough conceptual, analogous structure of reason and responsibility, that can allow the individual to reflect in their own life, to develop a private morality and an internal locus of control and all these other necessary psychological things for healthy development. And when we can collectively scapegoat and tell ourselves a narrative of collective destiny, then we can really delude ourselves, and we can derail ourselves, and we can make a fatalistic narrative idolatry or something like that. And that also helps us scapegoat and things like that. So at least if we have the rule of law, we will be confined within a structure, uh, so that we can know what accountability is like, and then we can understand, or at least we can have some common benchmark of what reason looks like. Because there's no, well, oh, the law is wrong, let's just change it. And then you're always just kind of, now the reason, the distinction between the rule of law is that you either have the rule of law or you have the rule of man. So I'm just expounding on exactly what the rule of law is, because I haven't defined it, and that stops me from making my point exactly. But this also goes back to the books of Samuel, and and Kings, which Samuel wrote as well. Um, that God never wanted the the Jewish people, Israel, to have a king. His preference was the judges. Now, I'm going to give my interpretation as to why kings are ungodly and bad things. Other people have, I'm going to give, and I think it's very clearly in the scripture itself, although it doesn't frame it when it's mentioned. But something that is said about Saul, and it's even framed like this. I can't remember the exact wording, but this is said multiple times in the book of in the books that Samuel wrote. It's said all over the place, and it says, and I can't remember exactly the phrasing, but this is what it essentially it kind of means, is that it says, and the people said, and it became a common verse that the people would ask this question, or that they made this query, and it became it actually says in the scripture that this became a saying, and the saying was, is the king, or is Saul one of the prophets? Is Saul one of the prophets? And I'm going to generalize that because I think that this is why God never wanted there to be a king. Because if you have kings, you will always ask the question, is the king one of the prophets? And that is an ungodly question. Because implicitly you will be haunted by that question. You can't get away from that question. If you have a king if you have a king ruling you, you will ask, is that king one of the prophets? And democracy is a king as well. So if you have a democracy, then you will ask yourself, is democracy one of the prophets? Now, it's not important whether the thing is you can't get away from that question. The only thing that gets you away from that question is if you have the rule of law, which is why God's preference was the judges. Because then at least then you're not looking for the gift of the prophet outside in the world. You're not looking for it external to you. You're asking that question inward. It's part of your spiritual journey or your spiritual question to ask. But if you're asking it about the world, if you're asking it about outside, then you're not asking it in the right place. You're not looking for it in the right place. You're not seeking that gift, that spiritual gift, which is one of it is perhaps the highest spiritual gift, is the gift of prophecy. And so you're not, you're not going to develop it within your communion or within your church. This is slightly anachronistic because that's a Christian framework which wasn't exactly in place during these times. But anyway, so this is why I believe that God never wanted a king for the Jewish people and for Israel. And in some sense, what my proposed political or governmental, constitutional, structural framework, how it solves this quandary and this conundrum, because you want to banish this question, is that it answers the question. That when you have the rule of law, because then the law becomes your king. So I'll kind of concede that semantically. So if you make the law your king, and if everyone is lorded over by the king of which is the law itself, and the law is somewhat concrete and crystallized and self-consistent and coherent, so it's actually a permanent fixture, as it were, then the answer to the question is the law, is the law a prophet, or is the king in that instance being the law, is the king a prophet? The answer to the question is no, it's not. It's not. So that's the end of the question. So if you want to look for the gift of prophecy, look for it elsewhere. Don't look for it in the dominion in the secular power structure. Look for it elsewhere. Because the law can be understood. It's rational. It will have self-consistent and coherent reasoning through it, and it somewhat is just it just becomes something that can be considered ordinary, and that ordinary benchmark is not going to be the divine justice. It's not going to be the solution to the human condition, but I believe it's going to be a necessary condition for prompting and promoting proper development, because then at least we have some stability in some sense, or not necessary stability, but it won't necessarily deliver stability, but it will, because you still have to have hope, but in some sense that's the point, is that you can't elevate it to the or exalt it to a status that it's going to be some Unitarian church, or it's going to be some general solution to some kind of collective narrative solution, or something like that. It very clearly, in some sense, makes a distinction between the private liberal sphere of culture and the hard power of the state, and there won't at least be that poisoning or confusion between those two things, because which that's really the poisonous thing, is when you conjoin power and authority, worldly power and authority and control, with divine conceptual, conceptualizations of divinity or sanctity, um, and you ask yourself, is the king one of the prophets? So, yeah, because I think that you want to avoid an idea of some kind of collective destiny, because that is going to be spiritually unhelpful, or at least retrograde, or it, a kind of inhibition, a kind of impediment, and this puts that conundrum, that quandary, to bed. It finishes that false, kind of confusion, as it were. And I don't know if I should continue making other comments, because this sparked some other ideas, just somewhat adjacent ideas. But I think the world is capable of moving towards this kind of general solution: is that we need to have the rule of law as opposed to the rule of man. This you have to take my point is that in America the democracy is the king, is the emperor, and they can just keep on changing the law and redefining things, and they don't really have a constitutional supremacy, or if they do, it's not really worth much, because the constitution immediately enthrones the democracy to do whatever it likes, essentially, and all the constitution does is prime the democracy with nice rhetoric and nice promises about things, which the democracy is allowed to define and semantically give effect to however it so wishes. And so the legislature of the democracy gets to change the form of the law. So the substantive law in America is an experiment that can change and be repromulgated. And so they are not confined to the law. They are confined to however they may choose to make the law, which is a never ending, they can even amend the Constitution forever, essentially. So, and there, it just isn't enough in the Constitution anyway to actually make an ironclad structure that could be called self-consistent or coherent, so much so that they depend on the democracy. So in some sense, if you really like the sentiments in your American Constitution, you have to keep on voting for the right people to keep it alive. And in some sense, the founding fathers said as much. They said, you have a republic if you can keep it, was Benjamin Franklin. And Father Fish told me this interesting quote as well. I think he said it was John Adams. I might be misremembering slightly, but it was something that that our constitution is only our form of republic, or something like that, is only decent for a moral society, or something like that. So you really are being dependent on the character or the moral virtue of the people themselves. And in some sense, I think that then you have created this horrible conflation, because you tacitly, I think they are depending on the idea that the people collectively will somehow act as some kind of collective prophet, or something like that. Um, and when you talk to Americans about their democracy, they often can make that point that I've just made, that collectively the people are sovereign and they deserve to be sovereign in their collective manifestation, or something like that. And it's not self-consistent, it's not reasonable. The reason and responsibility get strewn into a mystical, sort of mystique and narrative, which is really, I would say that in some sense what it amounts to is the idea is that you should consider the collective, the king in America, a prophet, essentially. And that is exactly why God never liked kings, as it were, and why he had a preference for judges. So, oh, that's at least uh, my view on these things, my understanding of these things. Um, so, uh, the other, the thing that I didn't necessarily want to bring up, but I will talk about it. But I don't know perhaps enough about Islam to talk too much about it. But I think that Islam is very capable of being compatible with my vision, uh, because there is no legitimate caliphate, or at least there isn't a caliphate that is at least not extremely controversial. And so long as the caliphate, I don't know in Islamic scholarship what is the general consensus on what the necessary conditions are in order to perform a restoration of the caliphate. I don't know even if it's possible for the restoration of the caliphate, because in some sense I think a cessation of the caliphate is probably not envisaged in some sense, and so its loss might by some people already be regarded as obviously there's the scholars are never, or some, on many issues the scholars are not in 100% agreement, but I don't know what but for me it would be very interesting to know the answer to the question is what are the different scholarly views on what conditions need to be met for the restoration of the caliphate. But it is my view that hopefully it will never be legitimately restored, and therefore only defensive jihad can ever be conscionable and envisaged, and there can be no offensive jihad ever waged ever again, which means that in countries that are not Islamic, the only way to spread Islam is by conversion, by willing conversion within a liberal democratic order, hopefully. And then that forces people to make, you know, to you know, now you see this might, in some sense, especially under the Islam is not necessarily uh, Islam is capable of being spread in many other different ways. Um, so you know this would be a kind of what I'm sort of saying is that if you had a secular state that Muslims accepted and belonged to, that then there would be a kind of de facto reformation, because of having to integrate the secular legal system with their own religious legal system, and still believing in their own religious preferences, but knowing that it was incompatible with the state, and therefore having to curtail some of the penalties, perhaps, or anyway. So it would somewhat alter the application of Islamic law, as it were, because Sharia would not generally be in effect. Something else would be in effect. but they, yeah. So it would be interesting to. Anyways, I'm opening a whole can of worms here, um, but to me, like, so I can perhaps see some kind of peaceful coexistence and synthesis in a modern society in which maybe everyone can exist peacefully, um, but a large portion of that is dependent on the fact that the caliphate will not reemerge. Because if the caliphate does reemerge, then uh, all bets are off, essentially, in terms of having a stable, uh, or at least in terms of the secular structure that I generally advocate for. But anyway, there are other interesting tangents that are somewhat related to that, but I'm not going to conjecture about those things. It's somewhat unseemly. But anyway, it was just the idea that we could all somewhat be united in agreeing in some basic common conception of justice. And it's interesting because I would even like to endorse some aspects of Islamic law. For instance, I think that we could borrow from Islam uh, some of its uh, claims and in its Sharia law, uh, some of it, the standards that it sets down, and use those in the secular legal system. Specifically, that I mean, I've people might have to be familiar with my other recordings, but essentially I say that the secular legal order should have a kind of moral anarchy, um, and there is, in some sense, there are only two touchy subjects here. Uh, the one is abortion, because if you're trying to only create a secular state and a legal framework um, that fundamentally it can do more. The democracy is still allowed to do more than, but essentially the framework of the justice system in the secular state has to know what rights to uphold, and sort of there is, in my view, a fundamental conflict between uh, the bodily autonomy of a female that is pregnant and the unborn child, and you can call it the right to life, and the right to life versus the bodily autonomy. You can't privilege the one without impinging on the other. So you can't, it's a zero-sum game in some sense. You either are going to say the bodily autonomy is more important or the right to life is more important. There's no getting around that. Whatever you give to the one, you take from the other. Now, my view on this uh, is that because of the need to bootstrap liberal self-determinism and self-ownership and self-possession of one's own rights, merely by the fact that the woman existed before the child and is already, usually older, and therefore has, you know is capable of expressing and communicating their choices about things, that their bodily autonomy needs to take precedence. And this doesn't mean that people that believe that this is a sin can't make that argument and can't make that moral argument. But if they want a woman to do something differently with her body, they must convince her. The level at which you want to have an intervention, it should not be on the level of force and through state authority. It should be on the level of making moral arguments. And so I think that we should be a society that deals in moral arguments and that expresses and communicates and engages on these things. And that is how you're going to banish abortion, not by doing it through the law. That's my particular view. But I do also see some room for compromise that I think that it's not unreasonable to say that a woman cannot have an abortion, certainly when the fetus is viable, and that date is always going down. But it's interesting, at some point you have to say how many weeks, you have to say how many months, and this exists within Sharia law. It's understood within Islamic theology, or that essentially the cutoff is essentially, well, it's not, maybe it's not exact, but essentially it's 4 months. That after, it's generally understood that the soul enters the body at 4 months, and I think that, or that's certainly enough time, or whatever, for a woman to and I think it's certainly feasible that at some point we're going to be able to incubate or have some kind of artificial gestation or something like that. So I mean, I'm very happy to import that from Islam. I think 4 months is a perfectly reasonable standard to put down. Um, I mean, if anything, I would maybe slightly, just on the safe side, because you never know when the actual date, when to start counting. So sort of 3.5 months or something like that. Just so that you can have a very delineated thing. Might be but what, 3.5 months would be 14 weeks. Anyway, and I'm actually, I find it convenient then to have a secular society that has Muslims a part of it, so that we can actually borrow this benchmark and import it into the secular law and say, um, and we can even use that as it's a renowned thing which is known or believed by one of the world's great religions. And it's certainly useful to borrow from the sanctity that has been entrenched by that tradition and by the Prophet. So, in my view, it's somewhat convenient to at least import that from Sharia. But essentially, so many, but essentially, because all I want the secular justice system to do is solve the intolerance paradox. And in some sense, there is a mini problem between a pregnant woman and the unborn child, because that, in some sense, is an insoluble problem. There is no way getting around that. One person's rights will be diminished, and another person's rights will be elevated if you take the right to life of the unborn child. And in my view, for practical reasons, we should err on the side of awarding self-determinism and proper self-ownership to the woman. And if we want her to make a more moral choice in our personal, private, religious views or moral views on the issue, we need to convince her freedom of conscience to choose a better option. But that is the right level of engagement, not through the law, not through the strong arm of the law. And so the law itself is not going to prohibit everything that is evil in many people's opinions. And that is in the realm of soft culture to lord over, or to, as people will do within their own freedom of association and freedom of conscience and freedom of contract and and free expression, freedom of expression. That is for that. that is that is yeah, and then people will take morality more seriously, because it will be very clear that the law is not the same as morality. We won't make this confused mixing anyway. But there is a need to have some benchmark and some standard in terms of the unborn child, in some sense, because that is a, as I've already described, a zero sum. Um, and so in some sense it does make sense to have some mediation, but a mediation in which you can still say that a woman has clearly uh, been given the upper hand in terms of exercising control and her bodily autonomy. um, and I would argue that they, I mean, I don't know offhand what the medical science is, but I'm pretty sure 4 months to some method is a viable fetus. Obviously not on its own, but through some procedure, 4 months is probably qualifies as viable with some kind of medical assistance, and that obviously poses a problem to a state that has to respect and protect the lives um, of its people. And so 3.5 months, or or if you can perfectly calculate it, under 4 months. Very glad to have uh, Islam to provide some kind of benchmark on that. Um, but not everything else, and everything else can still be uh, it can still be believed by people, but it's not going to, you can't have your own kangaroo court system. That we share a society, the we share a view of what justice is to be enforced. That is why that's how we can have a common society. Um, and if that society has the rule of law, then at least we can look to our own moral systems, and we can discuss and get to grips with those things. But at least then, I mean, I've said this before, reason and responsibility, at least there'll be a kind of a common benchmark and a common thread that won't tell us about what our spiritual morality should be, but it at least provides a kind of structured container in which that we can debate amongst ourselves, or we could try to convince each other. Um, anyway, and that I don't even see as, in some sense, you stop trying to treat the state as a Unitarian church, although the democracy and the politics of democracy is a slightly, the politics of a liberal democracy does get into another kind of gray area, but it's a gray area that will be pushed back on by the justice system, that the individual in a society will not be ruled by the majority moral sentiment if that majority moral sentiment is contravening the fundamental constitutional rights and framework. So the majority moral sentiment can still do things that it wants to do. It just has certain restrictions about how far it can go in doing that, or it has to implement processes and procedures, and it has to do it in a format that is compatible and consistent with such a constitution. So, you could have, and in some sense, probably the worst thing, or the most grey thing that a democracy then could do in such a situation, is that it could create public education that was some kind of indoctrination or something like that, and some people could, and that could, I mean, that's an argument that's a potential controversy that has no concrete resolution to it, but in some sense that's part of having a liberal democracy. And in some sense the liberal democracy is a completely separate story to the rule of law if a society has the rule of law, which in my view the only country that has ever had the rule of law ever has been South Africa. Because although the Romans were maybe one of the closest to it, but when they had an emperor, essentially the law gave the emperor dominion. Everything belonged to him. All the citizens were just other pieces of his property. He was the state incarnate. And so such a system did not have abstractly, and in some sense the Senate had that same power, although I guess actually when the Republic was in effect, I think the rights of the citizen, I think the Senate could still basically trounce some of the sanctity of the law, because you could the Senate could probably declare someone an enemy of the state, but essentially every citizen was protected by the law, but the Senate could probably still kind of semantically, because of their power to define things. This is why you need judges to hold the whip hand of reason and responsibility, but then they need to have enough substantive law and principles and values that they can do that independently of a democratic polity or something like that. Anyway, you need reason and responsibility to be the king, essentially. Not that it's going to be a divine king, but then at least the spirit of man, I would say, is in the right state, that it can precipitate the Son of Man, a proper understanding, a proper development. Because I don't think that life is going to be, that we're going to find a collective solution in some kind of collective fatalism or narrative that brings resolution to the human condition. It has to be achieved on the individual level of the individual understanding, has to attain to this. But anyway, I mean, that's my reading of the doctrine, which I'm not going to get into all the substantiations for that. But let me just think if there's a few other issues that I wanted to touch on that I've... I think if there are any other useful, important concepts on this. Let me just check my notes. Maybe I should talk about the understanding. So the reason why I say reason and responsibility and not logic, in my view, the problem with the Enlightenment is that it wasn't actually heavily embedded in reason. It was more about the cult of logic. And it's interesting, there's a parallel to this within the typology community, because a lot of people have the wrong definition of introverted thinking. TI, as it's otherwise sometimes referred to. Introverted thinking is often defined as correctness or truth in some accurate sense. TI, or introverted thinking, or logic, as some other, does not mean true or correct. It just means self-consistent. If something is logical, it's self-consistent. So you cannot parse something, P-A-R-S-E, parse something to be logical, and then because it is logical say that it is correct or true. It's not correct, it's just self-consistent. let me get into just a quick thing. I was recently watching something on Richard Dawkins, and he was talking about evolution and coevolution and this debate uh, between coevolution things, between sexual selection, and it really just exemplified to me this general point that you know, evolutionary theory really starts becoming abject nonsense when it starts talking about trying to describe co-evolved genes. Because if genes are co-evolved, you can never evolutionarily describe the dynamic that's going on between that pair of co-evolved genes. Evolution can never describe the internal in-between correlation that's going on in terms of how these things are connected. If you try to do that, all you're doing is you're saying, well, we've got this structure which we consider to be a narrative that explains or seemingly describes everything, and now we're just going to project that within the dynamic of the co-evolved, because in some sense, I mean, and this is why evolution itself ends up becoming nonsense. Because as soon as you have entities that are co-evolved, that means you've got entities that evolution has no grasp on properly understanding or discerning about. It has absolutely no reach into anything that is co-evolved. Because together they are evolved. But independently, what does co-evolved means? No one knows, no one can know, essentially. Or you can perhaps know it, but you're not going to know it through the theory of evolution. It's going to be completely ulterior to evolutionary theory. And if you try to describe it through evolutionary analogy or metaphor, that's just projection. That's just reductive nonsense at that point. And this is where the cult of logic gets you, is that you try to excuse yourself for doing that. There is no excuse for doing that. So you can say that, oh, you can do that, and if other people point out your bullshit, then you give the excuse and you say, well, there's nothing else. There's no other systematic narrative, and we need a narrative. We need an objective external locus of control. We need an abstract framework to project on everything. Otherwise, there is no unitary order in the world. So we obviously have to make God out of logic. We have to make logic the God of the universe. It's just sympathy pulling. It's just a kind of vulnerable narcissism. Oh, let me get away with this excuse. We need this. We need this consolation for our existentialism, because we haven't been able to reckon with the absurdity, the existential conundrum. We haven't tried to find that the only solution to that, the fundamental absurdity that you can always ask, well, if that is your explanation, then why that? Then why that? Then why that? Well, at some point you have to say, well, I'm going to endorse it. And why should I endorse it? And that then becomes a completely different. You have to be creative about your beliefs. And the necessary belief that needs to be created in order even to have humility is the belief in God, that there is one source, there is one Father. So that you don't have to be lonely in what you communicate, but the matter that you're communicating, sorry, I'm getting quite sophisticated very quickly, but the belief in God is something like a necessary vanity. And when I say vanity, I'm taking the scriptural definition of subjecting the same in hope. That you have to hope that we all have the same source, so that when we are communicating, what we mean can be received. that there is something that is parsing the same meaning at the other end, or at least is capable of parsing the same meaning. Now, that's a logical conjecture, but it's reasonably consistent with the presupposition of God, with the belief in God, which is a necessary belief, which, I'm absurdly framing it as the necessary vanity, the only necessary vanity. And then after that, and I would argue God doesn't do that much work, in the sense that we have to live through the Son of God, the only begotten Son of God, because there's only one way to understand God the Father. And if we understand that there's only one way to understand God the Father, then through that we can live in a shared spiritual culture, perhaps in a shared communion, in a spiritual life, that we can be brothers, spiritual brothers to one another, the brotherhood, the brethren. And or at least in the Christian understanding, the Son is in the image of the Father. But, essentially, how can you say that you love the Father when you don't love your brother? That's what it says in John, essentially. And what is God? God is love. But it also needs an understanding. You need to know how you are founded in your beliefs, because your beliefs are not things that you know. You believe them because you don't know them. But you can know that you have a necessary belief. And that is how you know the truth. And I know that might seem paradoxical, and that is somewhat the sacred secret. It rests on that kind of humility, that your hope is that committed and invested into it. And that is what discerning is. It is that activity of that hope. That is the intentional light that comes from the eye to reach out into the world, to search and to ask and to connect with that hope, with that vision, with that light, which was the light that was the light at the beginning, when God created himself into the universe. The first thing God created was light. The first thing that is created in real time, it says in the beginning, and God said, let there be light. The first thing that is actively created in the record of the scripture is light. And the light is the light of reason, but it's the light of reason that proceeds from the hope that I have described, that from the necessary belief that I have described, at least in the valence of the incarnation of the Son. And it's all over the scriptures, the sons of God. That is what we are. But there is only one begotten Son, which is the understanding. The condition of the mind that understands God and godliness. Anyway, this is incredibly esoteric. But there are scriptures all over the place that very clearly are encouraging people to transcend narratives and transcend lots of different confounding ways in which people obfuscate and relent reason and responsibility and self-consistency and coherence. And for example, quite a famous scripture which most people don't know about, most so-called Christians just kind of don't think about, but you really have to leave no stone unturned, which is also, I would say, another deep message which is in the Bible, that is how the rebirth happens, is that you have to, that's part of the process, is that you have to leave no stone unturned. The temple has to be destroyed and leave no stone unturned. Before the rebirth. But Jesus says, just to be worthy to be a disciple of him, you must hate your mother and your father and your brother and your sister and your own life. You must hate all these things. And that is for the development of the understanding. That is for the understanding to grow in self-consistency and coherence. Because if you are invested in saving these things, then you're going to lose the spiritual understanding. And so, if you're, going to avoid suffering or not look at the spiritual truth under suffering, that, there's spiritual truth to be found all over the place. There are lots of clouds of mystery to go searching through, and, many are interesting, but, in one of the clouds, that's when the Son of Man will be seen coming on a cloud. Because there are many mysteries to go thinking through. And in some sense, you can't even enter the mystery until to see the mystery and to contend with it on any level if you are materially invested in idolatry and idols and worldly structures, as it were. So I just want to make a parallel here. Listening to Paul van der Clay talk about the sacred secret self, which is in some sense how he is synthesizing some language, which is obviously has religious connotations, but how he is describing, the modern person, maybe in identity politics or something like that, and how they are stuck in their relativism. And I do think that the sacred secret self is the via negativa, is of that you get to when you hate all these things, that you disconnect from all these things, you detach, as the Buddhists might say. You detach from the world, and then you are alone in your sacred secret self, and then you get into the moment where, this is where the Father is necessary, because otherwise I'm always going to be alone in my solipsism. I'm always going to just be stuck, cordoned off in my relativism. And the only thing that can bridge that is a common Father, is a spiritual Father. And it's spiritual because I am using some semantic layer of pedagogy here, so I don't exactly mean this, but you don't know your beliefs, you believe them because of faith. So you don't know, you know that you don't know, that you are believing. Actually, Norm MacDonald articulated this point quite beautifully in some of his interviews. Very courageous person. Very honest, truth-orientated. I mean, this is how I break it down in terms of virtue, is in terms of the understanding, and I think I used to have 5 of these virtues, and now I can only remember 3. Maybe I must try to find my notes on it. But that is, it's not enough to merely have positive feelings. It is important to have seriousness. It is important to have carefulness. I always think as soon as you start dealing with someone who supposedly is a herald of some positive narrative, and then they start becoming very unserious, and they start becoming very uncareful. So I used to have tests attached to this to explain each of these virtues. I think the last one was kind of honesty. But these things interrelate with each other. But so you get carefulness, seriousness, and honesty. And when you start getting blatant dishonesty, um, or fudging, or I guess you could lump that in with self-deception, but also people that are playing a game in some sense, that they are very clearly playing some kind of game, uh, and in some sense, all of these things, you're dealing with that kind of. Sorry, I'm just trying to think what I. I mean, in my view, that to me is the delineation between people who belong to the world and people who are truth seekers and who are already apart from the world. And it's interesting that the followers of God, how they are described in the scriptures, the little flock, the peculiar even unto themselves. Sorry, not unto themselves, unto himself. Meaning himself being the Son of God or Christ. That in some sense only really makes sense when you put it in context of a potential communion, because that is the body of Christ. The members in particular are the body of Christ in a particular church. If you don't have a particular, and which is really where the spiritual life is going to be enjoyed, as it were, in the community of an actual communion where the gifts are being shared. And you can't expect that to be secular society. You can't expect that to be friends of the flesh and association. It's a very particular kind of association. Is a church, is a very particular kind of sorry, I'm just trying to think of the word. I guess it's just called communion. When you have agreed to enter into communion, which is quite explicitly symbolically described as eating each other's flesh and drinking each other's blood, and digesting this and eating it a second time. That the breaking of the bread is the breaking of the understanding and feeding it to each other, and digesting it and eating it yet again. Because it's not enough to just do it once and then it's done and dusted. Is that you have to do it thoroughly, so that you're properly careful and serious and honest about actually grappling with the bread that is, because the bread is the fleshly thinking that has to be broken down and digested, because that is how the spirit of man precipitates the Son of Man. That is how the point of communion is that we all have different strengths of different gifts, and this is how it is disseminated, as it were, or within the body. Anyway, but this is all private. This is not. This has nothing to do with the secular justice system, as it were. Anyway, I could make some ancillary points. So I do think that the American experiment has been a useful historical thing, because it has created a kind of spiritual fruit, but that spiritual fruit has, I would argue, it has taken root and grown in a sister city. It has developed in a foreign land, as spiritual fruit often does. The development of the spirit is not a neat lineage necessarily. It's not a heritable, or it's heritable in the spiritual sense. It's not heritable in the material sense or the worldly sense. And I do think in some sense, America was made to be this fighting over this issue to create a kind of spiritual food, kind of inspiration, a kind of, sort of food fight that other people could learn from watching, perhaps. Anyway, but I've talked about the American legal system quite a lot in my other recordings. And I mean, I think it's even been described by itself as the unlit altar. It is an altar of justice, but it is not. It waits for something. It's a kind of, it's an incomplete. I mean, it's a kind of experimental testing ground for something, perhaps. Somewhat perhaps goading God to precipitate the gift of prophecy to come and put an end to the experiment, as it were. But in the process, part of its work was in developing because in some sense, as I was trying to say, that we do come on the shoulders of those before us, and we come on the shoulders of Samuel, on the shoulders of Ezekiel, all of who designed and obviously sort of quite importantly also Paul. We're living in the machinations of God inspired men that set for us a spiritual developmental line. The Pauline apostasy, the apostolic line of Paul, and perhaps the secret covenant of the judges that relented to provide for Israel a king. At some point bring some kind of synthesis. Anyway, let me not talk in so much spiritual mysticism, but the apostle to the nations. I mean, should remember that there was an apostle to the nations. Which in Revelations we are told will be broken by, or like an iron rod breaks clay pots, judging them. And it is, anyway, it is said to one who fully, or if you take Revelations to be the not some worldly prophecy, but a spiritual development, a spiritual model of how the kingdom of God comes within, and the Christ consciousness is resolved and within one's own spiritual, the kingdom of God is at hand. It has always been said in the scriptures that one of the promises to those who will do the proper work of the seven churches is that in one of the promises is that you will sit with and on top of the throne, judging the nations. Anyway, let me not continue to make these loose connections and talk about all these different things. Is there anything else? Oh, let me check my notes one more time. I talked about logic. When I was talking about evolution is reductive nonsense, like a lot of abstract theory is, let me just make one more point about that, similar to that, is that eros, the Greeks in some sense already had a kind of mystery school understanding about some of this stuff, which is, that in the genealogy of the gods, that in the Greek pantheon, which is in some sense a kind of anthropomorphization of the elements of reality in some kind of metaphysical, sort of drama or archetypal drama. So in some sense, I always see the Greek pantheon as being kind of primitive psychology to some degree, but in allegory, and obviously in quite rich allegory because, it's anthropomorphized. But Eros is actually much older than Cupid. Eros is much more primal. And, if you actually look at the Greek genealogy, it's Nyx and Nox create Atmos, which is where we get the word atom. So Nyx and Nox are, I think Nyx or Nox, I'm not sure, I always get it mixed up, but I think one is the god of darkness and one is the god of something else, which is interesting because this is almost exactly what is in Genesis, because in Genesis, right at the start, it says, in the beginning, the earth was void and without form. So you can see void and without form is probably Nyx and Nox. And out of this Atmos and out of this Eros, love, and Eros is quite a primordial thing under which, and I would say that our intelligence lives within Eros, love, the life drive or whatever, Eros, and that Eros does not exist within evolution. Evolution always kind of really games the concept of agency, tries to systematize agency into some kind of total narrative of, sort of selective pressures are the inverse imprint of the survival that has co-evolved with it in some sense. But even within gender selection, where we know that there are therefore genes that are co-evolved, what is the interplay within that co-evolution? That is where everything exists. That's where language was developed. That's where intelligence has taken rise. All in that spiritual plane of belief, where because belief was able to be accessed by the form of life that we are, because it is in the image of God, which is faith itself, or which is an article of faith, which is a belief, which is spiritual. So we are a spiritual kind of form of life. It breaks the realm of logic. It is not contained therein. It's beyond the world, as it were. And that is why those who try to reduce themselves into beasts, they self you know, they self implode in some sense. You know, they because the solipsism just gets too burdensome, I guess. But and obviously that agitation gets vented in so many different ways. But which can certainly be destructive and chaotic. And anyway, I guess that's enough me pontificating about these things.